in the shattered silence of a defeated Berlin in April 1945, as artillery thundered closer to his bunker and the world he built collapsed in flames. Adolf Hitler faced death with no priest at his side, no prayer spoken aloud, no clear confession of faith. For a man who had invoked God millions of times, who had wrapped his movement in religious language and sacred imagery, the question lingered even in his final hours: did Hitler ever truly believe, or had religion always been a weapon? To understand Hitler's relationship with religion, one must begin not at the height of his power, but in the shadows of his youth. Born in 1889 in Austria, Hitler was raised in a Catholic environment shaped by rituals, symbols, and strict authority. As a child, he served briefly as an altar boy and absorbed the visual drama of the church: incense, ceremony, music, and hierarchy. Yet even early on, faith for Hitler was less about humility or compassion and more about spectacle and control. He admired authority, discipline, and the ability of institutions to command loyalty. Religion planted in him not devotion, but a lesson in mass influence. The First World War hardened this outlook. In the trenches, surrounded by death and chaos, Hitler developed a belief not in a loving God, but in destiny. Survival became proof of purpose. Like many soldiers, he interpreted his continued existence as evidence that he was chosen for something greater. This sense of personal mission replaced traditional faith. God, in Hitler's mind, was no longer a moral authority. It was a force that validated his own ambitions. When Germany collapsed in 1918, humiliated by defeat and economic ruin, Hitler entered politics with a sharp understanding of the German psyche. The nation was wounded, searching for meaning, longing for redemption. Christianity still shaped cultural identity, especially among Protestants and Catholics alike. Hitler recognized immediately that open hostility toward religion would alienate millions, so he spoke not as a skeptic but as a defender. Publicly, he claimed to stand for positive Christianity, a vague and carefully crafted term that stripped Christianity of compassion, mercy, and its Jewish origins, while preserving its emotional power. He spoke of Jesus not as a savior of sinners, but as a warrior against corruption. In his speeches, Christ became an Aryan fighter, and the cross became a symbol of struggle rather than sacrifice. This was not theology, it was reinvention. Privately, however, Hitler's views were far darker. In recorded conversations and accounts from close associates, he dismissed Christianity as weak, outdated, and incompatible with his vision of a brutal racial empire. He mocked its emphasis on forgiveness and equality, seeing it as a religion that glorified the weak and restrained the strong. Christianity, in his mind, had softened Germany. It had to be controlled, reshaped, or eventually destroyed. Yet Hitler was patient. Power first, truth later. Once he became chancellor in 1933, his approach to religion revealed a chilling precision. He did not abolish churches. Instead, he neutralized them. Through intimidation, legal pressure, and propaganda, the Nazi state brought religious institutions under surveillance and control. Protestant churches were fractured and manipulated through the creation of a state-aligned movement that fused Nazi ideology with Christian language. Crosses stood beside swastikas. Sermons echoed political loyalty. Faith was bent to serve the state. The Catholic Church, more centralized and cautious, posed a different challenge. Hitler signed a concordat with the Vatican, promising religious freedom in exchange for political neutrality. It was a calculated move, designed to silence opposition and gain international legitimacy. Once secured, the promise was quietly broken. Catholic schools were harassed, clergy arrested, youth groups dismantled. The agreement had served its purpose. Throughout the 1930s, Hitler continued to invoke God in public speeches, especially during moments of crisis or war. He spoke of divine providence guiding Germany, of sacred destiny, of a holy struggle against enemies both internal and external. These words were not accidental. They reassured believers, legitimized violence, and framed political aggression as moral necessity. War became sacred duty. Genocide became purification. Psychologically, this reveals a man who understood belief not as truth but as leverage. Hitler lacked the humility essential to genuine faith. He did not submit to God. He replaced God with himself. His ideology allowed no higher moral authority beyond the racial state and his own will. Religion was useful only so long as it served that will. The consequences were catastrophic. By hollowing out moral restraint and replacing it with blind obedience, Hitler helped create a society where cruelty could masquerade as righteousness. Ordinary people committed extraordinary crimes while believing they were serving a higher purpose. Churches, once potential centers of resistance, were weakened by compromise, fear, or false loyalty. Silence became complicity. As the war turned against Germany, Hitler's religious language grew more desperate and apocalyptic. He spoke of betrayal of unworthy people failing destiny. God, once invoked as ally, became silent. In his final writings, there is no repentance, no prayer, no acknowledgement of divine judgment, only rage, blame, and delusion. The man who claimed divine guidance died abandoned by the very faith he had exploited. Hitler's relationship with religion was never about belief. It was about power. He understood that faith shapes identity, that symbols move hearts faster than reason, and that sacred language can justify unspeakable acts. By manipulating religion, he transformed spiritual longing into political obedience and moral certainty into moral collapse. The lesson left behind is not only about one man, but about human vulnerability. When faith is stripped of conscience and handed to power, it becomes a weapon. When leaders claim divine authority without moral accountability, destruction follows. History does not warn us that belief is dangerous, but that belief without truth, humility, and humanity can become one of the most dangerous forces of all. Hitler did not reject religion outright. He studied it carefully, dissected it patiently, and learned how to use it as one of the most effective instruments of mass control and emotional manipulation in modern history. This distinction is crucial because it explains why religion survived under the Nazi regime not as a moral force, but as a hollowed-out shell filled with propaganda, fear, and political loyalty. Adolf Hitler was not an atheist crusader attempting to destroy belief from the outside. He was something far more dangerous, a man who understood belief deeply enough to weaponize it. From an early age, Hitler was surrounded by religious structure. Growing up in late 19th century Austria, Catholicism was not merely a personal faith, but a cultural framework that shaped daily life, authority, ritual, and identity. Churches commanded obedience. Priests spoke with unquestioned authority, and sakar. Symbols inspired reverence and submission. Young Hitler absorbed these lessons instinctively. Even as his personal faith weakened, his fascination with how religion disciplined minds and unified crowds only grew stronger. What stayed with him was not doctrine or compassion, but the power of ceremony, symbolism, and unquestioned belief. This understanding matured during the First World War. In the trenches, where death was constant and meaning scarce, Hitler developed an intense belief in destiny rather than in God. Survival became proof of purpose. He came to see himself as an instrument of a higher force, not accountable to it. This psychological shift was decisive. Faith, in Hitler's mind, ceased to be a relationship with the divine and became a narrative that justified personal ambition. God was no longer something to obey. God was something to claim. After Germany's defeat in 1918, the nation entered a period of humiliation, economic collapse, and spiritual confusion. Traditional institutions had failed, yet people still clung to familiar sources of meaning, Churches remained influential. Millions of Germans identified as Christian, and religious language still carried emotional weight. Hitler recognized this immediately. To attack religion directly would have been political suicide. To ignore it would have been a wasted opportunity. Instead, he chose a third path: manipulation. As Hitler rose through the ranks of the Nazi Party, his speeches became carefully calibrated performances. He spoke of God, providence, and sacred duty, not to express devotion, but to create moral legitimacy. He framed political goals as divine missions and enemies as moral evils. This strategy allowed him to transform ordinary political struggle into something resembling a holy cause. Support for him no longer felt like a political choice. It felt like a moral obligation, central. To this manipulation was his invention of positive Christianity, a term deliberately vague and emotionally appealing. It reassured believers while meaning almost nothing in concrete terms. Under this banner, Christianity was stripped of its core teachings: love for enemies, humility, mercy, and universal human dignity, and reshaped into a militant, nationalistic faith. Jesus was recast not as a suffering servant, but as a fighter against corruption. The message was clear: true faith did not challenge power, it served it. Privately, Hitler's contempt for Christianity was unmistakable. In conversations recorded by close associates, he mocked the religion as weak and incompatible with his vision of a ruthless racial empire. He despised its concern for the poor and vulnerable, seeing such values as obstacles to natural selection and domination. Yet this contempt never translated into immediate confrontation. Hitler understood timing. Religion, he believed, could be dealt with later. First, it had to be controlled. Once in power, his approach revealed cold calculation rather than ideological passion. Churches were neither banned nor embraced. They were infiltrated, pressured, and neutralized. Protestant churches were divided and reshaped through state-supported movements that blended Nazi ideology with Christian language. Religious symbols were allowed to remain, but their meaning was redirected. Loyalty to God was subtly replaced with loyalty to Führer and nation. Faith became performance. The Catholic Church, with its centralized authority, required a different tactic. Hitler signed a formal agreement guaranteeing religious freedom, a move that gained him international credibility and domestic calm. But this promise was tactical, not sincere. Once political stability was secured, restrictions followed. Clergy were monitored, youth organizations dismantled, and dissent punished. The agreement had served its purpose: silence. This entire strategy depended on Hitler's psychological insight into human behavior. He understood that people do not abandon belief easily, especially in times of fear. But they can be guided, redirected, and reassured. By allowing religious language to survive while emptying it of ethical resistance, Hitler ensured that belief would no longer challenge violence. Instead, it would bless it. The consequences were profound. When moral authority is replaced by political authority wearing religious clothing, conscience collapses. Ordinary citizens, convinced they were serving a higher good, became participants in exclusion, persecution, and eventually mass murder. Religion, which might have inspired resistance, often became a tool of normalization. Silence was framed as loyalty. Doubt became betrayal. It is important to recognize that Hitler did not create this vulnerability, he exploited it. His manipulation worked because people wanted certainty, belonging, and meaning. He provided these through a distorted moral universe in which obedience was virtue and cruelty was necessity. Faith, once a source of restraint, became an accelerant. By the later years of the war, Hitler's religious language grew darker and more apocalyptic. He spoke of destiny betrayed and divine missions unfulfilled, not with humility, but with rage. God was no longer a guiding force, but a rhetorical weapon turned against his own people. When defeat became inevitable, The religious mask slipped entirely. There was no repentance, no prayer, no submission to judgment, only bitterness and blame. This trajectory reveals the true nature of Hitler's relationship with religion. He did not believe in it, nor did he fight it. He studied it. He understood how belief can override reason, how sacred language can sanctify violence, and how moral certitude can silence doubt. Religion was not his enemy. Independent conscience was. The warning embedded in this history extends far beyond Nazi Germany. When belief is detached from ethical responsibility and placed in the service of power, it becomes a force capable of immense destruction. Hitler's manipulation of religion demonstrates that the greatest danger is not faith itself, but faith emptied of humanity and controlled by ambition. It shows how easily sacred ideas can be turned into tools of domination when people surrender moral judgment in exchange for certainty and belonging. In the end, Hitler proved that one does not need to destroy belief to rule absolutely. One only needs to redefine it. Publicly, Adolf Hitler carefully crafted the image of a man standing shoulder to shoulder with Christianity, presenting himself as a protector of German faith and tradition at a time when millions feared moral collapse and cultural disintegration. In speech after speech, he invoked God, divine will, and sacred duty, fully aware that religious language carried immense emotional power in a society still deeply shaped by Christian identity. To the average German listener, his words suggested continuity rather than rupture, reassurance rather than revolution. Yet behind closed doors, stripped of the theatrical language and public performance, Hitler harbored deep contempt for the very moral foundations of Christianity he claimed to defend. In the turbulent years following Germany's defeat in the First World War, Christianity remained a central pillar of social life. Churches were places of comfort amid hunger, inflation, and political chaos. Hitler understood that any movement seeking mass loyalty could not afford to alienate believers. From the earliest days of his political rise, he presented National Socialism not as an enemy of Christianity, but as its natural ally. He far aimed his struggle as one against godlessness, moral decay, and foreign corruption, carefully positioning himself as a restorer of order and spiritual purpose. This public posture was never accidental. Hitler was a gifted political actor who understood that belief is often emotional rather than theological. He did not need to convince people of doctrine. He only needed to make them feel that their faith was safe in his hands. By speaking of Christianity as a cultural heritage under threat, he tapped into fear and nostalgia. Faith became a symbol of national identity rather than a moral compass. Yet even as he praised Christianity in public, Hitler quietly redefined it. His speeches rarely referenced compassion, forgiveness, or humility, the core virtues of Christian teaching. Instead, he emphasized struggle, sacrifice, obedience, and purity. Christianity, as he described it, was not about loving one's neighbor, but about defending the nation. This subtle shift allowed millions to hear familiar words while absorbing an entirely different message. The language remained sacred, the meaning was transformed. In private conversations, Hitler was far less restrained. Accounts from close associates reveal a man who viewed Christianity as weak, outdated, and fundamentally incompatible with his worldview. He despised its emphasis on mercy and equality, seeing these ideas as obstacles to natural hierarchy and domination. To Hitler, the Christian insistence on the value of every human life clashed directly with his racial ideology, which ranked human worth according to blood and utility. Christianity's moral universalism threatened the very foundation of his vision. This contradiction was not a moral struggle within Hitler, it was a calculated division between performance and belief. He did not wrestle with faith, he exploited it. Christianity, in his eyes, had succeeded in one crucial respect. It had proven how effectively a belief system could command loyalty, discipline behavior, and shape identity. But its ethics, he believed, had outlived their usefulness. What he admired was not its message, but its machinery. Once in power, this dual approach became policy. Hitler did not immediately move against the churches because he understood their influence. Instead, he sought to neutralize them by encouraging a version of Christianity that aligned with Nazi ideology. Protestant churches were pressured to adopt state-approved leadership and nationalist theology. Sermons echoed political loyalty. Crosses shared space with swastikas. The outward appearance of faith remained intact, while its moral authority quietly eroded. The Catholic Church, more resistant and centralized, was handled with cautious diplomacy. Hitler publicly affirmed religious freedom and signed agreements promising non-interference. These gestures reinforced his image as a defender of Christianity on the world stage. But privately, he regarded these agreements as temporary measures, tools to buy time and suppress opposition. Once stability was secured, violations followed. Clergy were intimidated, organizations dissolved, and outspoken figures silenced. The promises were never meant to be permanent. Psychologically, this reveals a man who understood that open confrontation with belief could create martyrs, while quiet manipulation could create compliance. Hitler did not want to destroy Christianity immediately. He wanted to empty it of resistance. By allowing people to believe they were still faithful, he removed the moral urgency to oppose him. Faith became passive, ritualistic, and politically harmless. The cost of this deception was immense. When religious leaders echoed state ideology or remained silent in the face of injustice, ordinary believers followed. The ethical voice that might have challenged persecution was muted. People who might have resisted violence instead rationalized it, convinced that their leaders stood on the side of God. Christianity, stripped of its moral spine, became a cultural ornament rather than a force of conscience. As the war progressed and the regime grew more radical, Hitler's private contempt for Christianity became increasingly visible among his inner circle. He spoke openly of a future in which traditional religion would fade away, replaced by a racial ideology that demanded total loyalty. Christianity, he believed, belonged to the past. Power belonged to the present. Yet even then, he continued to use religious language in public, especially during moments of crisis, when fear made people cling more tightly to familiar symbols. This duplicity reached its final expression in Hitler's last days. The man who had claimed divine support offered no prayer, sought no forgiveness, and acknowledged no higher judgment. There was no trace of Christian humility in his final words, only bitterness, blame, and unwavering belief in his own righteousness. The public defender of Christianity died as a man who had long since rejected its moral heart. This contrast between public posture and private belief exposes one of the most dangerous dynamics in political history. When leaders claim to defend faith while despising its ethics, belief becomes a mask for ambition. Hitler's example demonstrates how easily religion can be used to legitimize power while being hollowed out from within. It is not the rejection of faith that proved catastrophic, but its exploitation. The deeper lesson lies not only in Hitler's actions, but in human vulnerability. People trusted the sound of familiar words without examining their meaning. They mistook protection of tradition for moral integrity. In doing so, they allowed a leader who despised the soul of their faith to use it against them. History shows that when belief is reduced to identity and stripped of conscience, it becomes easy to control and devastating in its consequences. Positive Christianity was never a religion in the true sense of the word. It was a political invention, deliberately vague and emotionally charged, designed to fuse centuries-old faith with the brutal ambitions of Nazi ideology. It existed not to guide consciences, but to silence them. By redefining Christianity without openly destroying it, Adolf Hitler created a belief system that felt familiar enough to be trusted and flexible enough to be controlled. In early 20th century Germany, Christianity was not merely a private belief, but a cultural backbone. Church attendance, Christian holidays, and biblical language shaped everyday life across Protestant and Catholic communities alike. Hitler understood that any ideology seeking total dominance had to either crush this tradition or absorb it. Crushing it would provoke resistance. Absorbing it would neutralize opposition. Positive Christianity was the mechanism through which this absorption occurred. The brilliance and danger of the concept lay in its emptiness. Hitler never clearly defined what positive Christianity meant. There were no fixed doctrines, no theological foundations, no binding moral principles. This ambiguity was intentional. It allowed millions of believers to project their own understanding onto the term while allowing the Nazi state to reshape its meaning whenever necessary. It sounded reassuring, patriotic, and faithful, without demanding accountability to any established church or scripture. At its core, positive Christianity stripped Christianity of its most challenging elements. Teachings about loving one's enemy, caring for the weak, and recognizing the equal worth of all human beings were quietly removed. In their place came ideas of struggle, obedience, racial purity, and sacrifice for the nation. Faith was no longer about moral transformation. It was about loyalty. The cross remained, but its message changed. One of the most radical distortions involved the figure of Jesus himself. Under positive Christianity, Jesus was recast not as a Jewish teacher preaching humility and mercy, but as an Aryan hero fighting corruption and enemies. This grotesque revision allowed Nazi ideology to coexist with open anti-Semitism while maintaining a Christian appearance. The historical and ethical roots of Christianity were severed, replaced by myth and propaganda. This transformation did not happen overnight. It unfolded gradually through speeches, party platforms, educational materials, and church pressure. Hitler understood that belief systems change most effectively when people feel continuity rather than rupture. By keeping Christian language while redefining its meaning, the regime avoided triggering widespread alarm. People heard familiar words and assumed familiar values, even as those values were being hollowed out. Psychologically, this approach exploited a deep human tendency, the desire to believe that one's moral world remains intact even as circumstances change. Positive Christianity reassured believers that they did not have to choose between faith and nation, between God and Führer. The illusion of harmony prevented many from recognizing the moral compromise taking place. Faith became comfortable, unchallenging, and politically safe. Institutionally, this concept proved devastating. Protestant churches, already fragmented, were especially vulnerable. State-approved religious leaders promoted nationalist theology, blending biblical references with racial ideology. Sermons echoed state narratives. Church youth groups were absorbed into Nazi organizations. Christianity did not disappear. It was domesticated. The church remained standing, but its prophetic voice was gone. Even resistance within religious circles was weakened by this ambiguity. Those who sensed the corruption struggled to articulate it clearly because positive Christianity lacked concrete definitions to attack. The regime could always claim that it was defending faith, merely interpreting it differently. Dissenters were portrayed not as moral critics, but as troublemakers undermining national unity. The Catholic Church, though more centralized, faced similar pressures. While it did not formally adopt positive Christianity, the existence of a state-sanctioned Christian narrative limited its ability to challenge the regime openly. The Nazis could present themselves as defenders of religion, while accusing critics of political interference. Faith was turned into a shield against accountability. The consequences of this ideological distortion extended far beyond church walls. By removing Christianity's moral restraints, positive Christianity helped normalize exclusion, persecution, and violence. If faith no longer demanded compassion, then cruelty could be justified as necessity. If moral worth was tied to race and usefulness, then suffering became acceptable. Millions participated in or tolerated injustice while believing they remained morally upright. This was not accidental. Hitler understood that lasting power requires moral legitimacy, or at least the appearance of it. Positive Christianity provided that legitimacy by sanctifying obedience. It taught people not to ask whether something was right, but whether it was loyal. In this environment, conscience became subordinate to ideology. As the Nazi regime grew more radical, the emptiness of positive Christianity became increasingly apparent to those closest to power. Hitler himself viewed it as temporary, a transitional tool. Traditional religion, he believed, would eventually wither away, replaced by a racial worldview demanding total devotion. Christianity had served its purpose by easing the population into obedience. It could be discarded later. Yet even as this private contempt deepened, the public use of positive Christianity continued. During war, crisis, and hardship, religious language was especially useful. It comforted the fearful, justified sacrifice, and framed destruction as destiny. Faith, stripped of ethics, became emotional anesthesia. In the end, positive Christianity collapsed along with the regime that created it. It left no spiritual legacy, no enduring theology, no moral insight. What remained was the damage it had done, a demonstration of how easily religion can be emptied of meaning and refilled with violence when power controls interpretation. The true danger of positive Christianity was not that it replaced faith, but that it pretended to preserve it. It allowed people to believe they were faithful while abandoning the very principles that gave faith its moral force. It showed that religion does not need to be destroyed to become dangerous. It only needs to be redefined by those who seek control. This episode stands as a warning far beyond its historical moment. When belief becomes a servant of ideology rather than a check upon it, when sacred language is used to sanctify power instead of challenge it, faith loses its soul. Positive Christianity was proof that the most effective corruption of belief is not open hostility, but quiet transformation, where words remain holy, but meaning is lost and conscience fades without protest. The manipulation of religious institutions under Adolf Hitler did more than silence opposition. It reshaped the moral landscape of an entire society, weakening resistance and enabling widespread complicity in crimes that would have otherwise demanded conscience, protest, and refusal. By bending churches to the will of the state and hollowing out their ethical authority, the Nazi regime removed one of the last potential barriers between ordinary people and extraordinary evil. In Germany of the early 20th century, churches were not marginal institutions. They were embedded in daily life, shaping moral education, community bonds, and personal identity. For millions, religious leaders were trusted voices in times of uncertainty. Hitler understood that these institutions, if left independent, could become centers of resistance. They possessed moral legitimacy that rivaled political power. Rather than confronting them openly, he chose a more effective strategy: control without destruction. This control was subtle, gradual, and psychologically precise. The Nazi state allowed churches to remain open, rituals to continue, and religious language to survive. On the surface, life appeared normal. Beneath that surface, however, pressure mounted steadily. Clergy were monitored, sermons were scrutinized, youth groups were dismantled or absorbed into state organizations. The message was clear without being openly declared. Religion was permitted only so long as it did not challenge power. This atmosphere of intimidation changed behavior long before it produced open collaboration. Many religious leaders, fearing arrest or closure, softened their language. Moral clarity gave way to caution. Silence replaced protest. What might have begun as strategic restraint gradually became moral paralysis. Each compromise made the next one easier. Over time, the absence of resistance itself became normalized. The psychological impact of this transformation cannot be overstated. When trusted ions fail to speak, individuals reinterpret silence as approval. Ordinary believers looked to their churches for guidance and saw no clear condemnation of exclusion, persecution, or violence. In that void, Nazi ideology stepped in, offering certainty, belonging, and moral justification. Without strong religious opposition, the state's narrative filled the space where conscience once lived. This did not require enthusiastic support. Passive compliance was enough. Many Germans did not consider themselves perpetrators. They saw themselves as bystanders, focused on survival, family, and duty. But by continuing to participate in daily life, while neighbors were excluded, deported, and murdered, they became part of the machinery. The absence of moral resistance allowed injustice to proceed smoothly, bureaucratically, and efficiently. Religious institutions played a crucial role in this process, not always through action, but through inaction. When sermons avoided uncomfortable truths, when prayers ignored suffering outside approved boundaries, when faith was reduced to private comfort rather than public responsibility, the ethical demands of belief were quietly suspended. Religion became inward-looking, focused on personal salvation rather than collective responsibility. Hitler's strategy depended on this inward turn. A faith concerned only with individual piety poses little threat to power. By encouraging religion to retreat from public morality, the regime ensured that political decisions would go unchallenged by ethical authority. Violence could then be framed as necessity, law, or destiny rather than sin. The erosion of resistance also occurred through fragmentation. Protestant churches, divided and pressured, struggled to present a united moral stance. Disagreements over theology and politics weakened their ability to confront the regime collectively. Isolated voices of dissent were easier to silence or discredit. Without institutional backing, resistance became dangerous and rare. Even among those who sensed the moral corruption taking place, fear played a decisive role. The consequences of speaking out were real: arrest, imprisonment, social exclusion, and worse. Hitler understood that terror does not need to be constant. It only needs to be visible enough to shape behavior. A few high-profile punishments were sufficient to encourage widespread self-censorship. This environment produced a tragic distortion of moral reasoning. People began to separate private belief from public action. They told themselves that inward faith was enough, that survival required compromise, that responsibility lay elsewhere. Each rationalization reduced personal accountability. Evil did not appear as monstrous acts committed by villains, but as ordinary routines carried out by neighbors, clerks, and officials who believed they had no choice. The consequences extended far beyond Germany's borders. The weakening of internal resistance enabled the regime to mobilize society for total war and genocide. Without strong moral opposition, policies escalated rapidly. Each step built upon the last, normalized by silence and justified by obedience. What might have been unthinkable became routine. It is important to recognize that resistance did exist. Some clergy and believers spoke out, sheltered victims, and paid with their freedom or lives. Their courage highlights what was possible and what was lost. But they were exceptions in a system designed to isolate and suppress moral defiance. Their sacrifices stand as reminders of how costly resistance became once institutions failed to protect it. The long-term damage of this manipulation did not end with the fall of the Nazi regime. After the war, German society faced not only physical destruction, but moral reckoning. Many asked how such crimes could have occurred in a culture shaped by centuries of religious tradition. The answer lay not in the absence of faith, but in its distortion. Belief had survived, but conscience had been weakened. This history reveals a sobering truth about human behavior. People do not need to be convinced to commit evil. They only need to be reassured that it is not their responsibility to stop it. When institutions meant to uphold moral values become instruments of power or retreat into silence, They leave individuals unprotected against ideological pressure. Hitler's manipulation of religious institutions demonstrates that the greatest danger arises when moral authority is absorbed by political authority. When churches cease to challenge injustice and instead adapt to it, they lose the very purpose that gives them meaning. Faith without moral courage becomes decoration, comforting, familiar, and ultimately complicit. The lesson extends beyond one nation or one era. Any society that allows its moral institutions to be neutralized in the name of unity, security, or survival risks repeating the same pattern. Evil advances not only through hatred, but through quiet accommodation. Resistance does not collapse in a single moment. It erodes through countless small silences. In Nazi Germany, those silences became pathways to catastrophe. By weakening religious resistance, Hitler did not merely remove opposition. He reshaped the moral instincts of a population. In doing so, he proved that when conscience is muted and authority goes unchallenged, even ordinary people can become participants in extraordinary crimes. Hitler's use of religion stands as a timeless warning about how power can corrupt faith and turn belief into violence, not through open destruction, but through gradual distortion that feels safe, familiar, and even righteous. This warning reaches far beyond the borders of Nazi Germany and far beyond the 20th century because it exposes a permanent vulnerability in human nature, the desire to believe that power and morality can walk hand in hand without conflict. At its core, faith is meant to place limits on power. It introduces accountability beyond human authority, reminding individuals and rulers alike that there are moral boundaries that cannot be crossed without consequence. Hitler understood this instinctively, and that is precisely why he worked to undermine it without appearing to do so. He did not seek to abolish belief outright, because belief that challenges power is dangerous, but belief that serves power is invaluable. The transformation of religion into an instrument of violence begins with a subtle shift in focus. Moral principles are replaced by identity. Belief becomes less about how one should act and more about who one belongs to. Under Hitler, faith was no longer measured by compassion or justice, but by loyalty, obedience, and national unity. Once belief is tied to identity rather than ethics, it becomes easier to justify cruelty in the name of protection or survival. This process does not require people to abandon their sense of being moral. On the contrary, it allows them to preserve it. That is what makes it so dangerous. When individuals believe their actions are sanctioned by a higher cause, whether divine destiny, national salvation, or historical necessity, they stop questioning the human cost. Violence becomes duty. Suffering becomes collateral. Doubt becomes betrayal. Hitler's genius, if it can be called that, lay in his ability to present himself as a moral leader without submitting to morality himself. By surrounding his ideology with religious language and sacred imagery, he shielded it from scrutiny. Actions that would otherwise provoke outrage were reframed as unfortunate necessities in a larger, meaningful struggle. The result was a society in which people could participate in injustice while believing they were defending something sacred. This pattern reveals an uncomfortable truth. Belief does not automatically produce virtue. Without critical reflection and moral courage, belief can be redirected toward almost any end. History shows repeatedly that faith alone does not prevent atrocity. In some cases, when manipulated by power, it accelerates it. Hitler's Germany was not a society devoid of belief. It was a society where belief had been captured. The danger intensifies when leaders claim exclusive access to truth or divine will. By presenting himself as an instrument of destiny, Hitler positioned dissent not merely as political opposition, but as moral corruption. Those who questioned him were not just wrong, they were enemies of a higher purpose. This framing made resistance emotionally and psychologically difficult. To oppose the leader felt like opposing meaning itself. Once this dynamic takes hold, ordinary moral safeguards collapse. People stop asking whether an action is right and begin asking whether it is necessary. Responsibility dissolves into obedience. Individuals convince themselves that accountability lies elsewhere, with leaders, systems, or history. In such an environment, atrocities can be committed by people who do not see themselves as cruel, only as compliant. The tragedy is that this corruption of belief often feels comforting rather than alarming. It simplifies a complex world into clear categories of good and evil, us and them, loyalty and betrayal. It relieves individuals of moral ambiguity by offering certainty. Hitler exploited this hunger for clarity in a time of fear and instability. The more chaotic the world felt, the more appealing his moral absolutism became. This is why the lesson of Hitler's manipulation of religion is not confined to extremist regimes or distant history. It applies wherever belief is used to shield power from accountability. Whenever leaders wrap themselves in sacred language to justify harm, whenever faith is invoked to silence conscience rather than awaken it, the same danger emerges. The names change. The symbols change. The mechanism remains. A belief system loses its moral force the moment it stops protecting the vulnerable and starts protecting authority. Hitler's Germany demonstrates how quickly this reversal can occur when fear is present and institutions fail to resist. Once belief becomes a tool of dominance, it no longer restrains violence, it authorizes it. The most chilling aspect of this history is not the fanaticism of the few, but the compliance of the many. Millions did not see themselves as evil. They saw themselves as normal people living through extraordinary times. They prayed, worked, raised families, and followed rules. Yet the moral framework that might have compelled them to resist had been quietly dismantled. Faith remained, but its ethical demands had been removed. This is the ultimate warning embedded in Hitler's relationship with religion. Evil does not always arrive announcing itself as evil. Sometimes it arrives speaking the language of virtue, tradition, and destiny. It asks not for hatred but for loyalty, not for cruelty but for sacrifice. By the time its true nature is revealed, conscience has already been trained to remain silent. History shows that the most dangerous form of power is not the one that rejects morality, but the one that claims to embody it. When leaders present themselves as moral authorities beyond question, belief becomes an instrument of control rather than a safeguard against abuse. In such moments, the responsibility of individuals becomes even greater, not smaller. The collapse of Nazi Germany revealed the cost of this failure. After the destruction, many were forced to confront the uncomfortable realization that belief alone had not saved them from moral catastrophe. Some had prayed while atrocities unfolded. Others had trusted institutions that chose silence over courage. The reckoning was not only political but spiritual. The enduring lesson is stark and unavoidable. Faith must challenge power, not sanctify it. Belief must demand accountability, not excuse obedience. When ideology, religious or otherwise, claims immunity from moral scrutiny, it becomes capable of immense harm. Hitler's legacy is not merely a record of violence, but a warning etched into history about the fragility of conscience under pressure. This warning does not ask humanity to abandon belief. It asks humanity to protect it from manipulation, from fear, and from those who would use it as a weapon. It reminds us that the true measure of belief is not how passionately it is proclaimed, but how steadfastly it defends human dignity when power demands silence.